Now, apart from your piece on this, have you seen other Canadian outlets cover this in a critical way the way you have? I mean, this is the kind of thing where I feel if there was enough public pressure, including from our media that should be looking after, the average Canadian, that there would be some, real pushback on this, and they would maybe go back and revisit this idea. But if there is no critical eye on them, and they're not feeling any real pressure from their constituents, and they aren't hearing anything because people simply don't know about it, then they're not going to actually answer to the average Canadian. So have you seen other media cover this?
I mean, there has been some coverage. We might have talked about this back last year, just between you and I know that Ricochet, another left-wing independent news site in Canada, did some polling on this similarly last year with North 99 and other groups, and they've talked about this. Basically, within left-wing media, this is talked about. How the NDP has an opportunity through tax reform to represent, like, the desires of regular Canadians. The vast majority of regular Canadians want a wealth tax. If anything, the NDP's proposal is too modest. There's been a lot of these discussions, but one of the few pieces I remember, like the Financial Post, the business section of the National Post, wrote an attack on Jagmeet Singh for this. And that was kind of great because it's kind of like a Bernie anti-endorsement where, like, a hedge fund manager goes at you so you're doing it right.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think Linda McQuaig, who is a progressive columnist at the Toronto Star, did write a piece about this last year or earlier this year, where she basically said what you were saying right there. It's like, we get a policy here that's needed, that's impactful, that's timely, that has massive support from Canadians, and yet no one's talking about it. CBC doesn't talk about it. The Global doesn't talk about it. CTV doesn't talk about it. The Toronto Star, except for her column, doesn't talk about it. And so it's like there is this certain radio silence from corporate media in this country. And unlike in the US, we don't have quite the robust independent media, especially in audiovisual mediums, to sort of counter the spin. And I think that is a big factor why isn't Justin Trudeau, why doesn't he even have to answer questions about why he doesn't support a wealth tax? Like,
yeah, exactly.
I don't even know if he's ever been asked about that outside of maybe question period, which, doesn't necessarily get covered all that much.
Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of thing where I didn't know about this motion at all until you messaged me about it, and I was like, wow, why haven't I heard about this yet? And it seems like a big deal, but with so little coverage, the average Canadian, unless they're watching us or reading, Ricochet, they're not going to really know about what is going on behind the scenes. Now, I want to bring up I noticed going through the specific votes on who voted for and against that there were several people that didn't vote at all. One of them was Aaron O'Toole. Aaron O'Toole did not vote at all on the wealth tax motion. I feel like he's begun to play this game. I'm not sure his reasoning. Maybe he has a better reason for not voting, but he's playing this game now where he's trying to pretend to be the party or the representative of labor, of unions, and he's talking about how labor has been hurt by the Liberals. Do you want to just address that briefly and discuss how the Conservatives clearly, while this is a brilliant strategy, I think, if for a lot of people who don't maybe know about the Conservatives and their push or their fight against unions and organized labor, it's a brilliant strategy. But clearly, if anybody knows anything, and hopefully if it's covered enough in a future election, hopefully people can see through this. But just to address the idea that Aaron O'Toole represents, labor.
Well, he doesn't, right? He doesn't represent. And to be fair, though, neither do the Liberals, right? They don't either. It can be said that, there were a couple provisions under the previous Harper government that effectively would have the government, get detailed financial records of every transaction unions would do. And it was a big invasion of privacy into unions. And the Liberals did sort of scrap some of those provisions that likely would have been found unconstitutional anyway. But the point is that O'Toole in no way represents workers. But what's crucial is he's shifting his rhetoric a little bit, which is that, part of the challenge of the Conservatives in the past is that we've only talked about GDP and we've only talked about tax cuts and and an opportunity, but we've often failed to translate that into what it means for workers. And I mean, when conservatives historically, they've often found success when they've been able to do that. I mean, this is a long time ago, but it used to be the case that some parts of the working class supported the conservatives more because they were seen as the party that were against free trade back in the late 18 and early 1900s. And if you were a manufacturing worker in Montreal or Toronto, it was likely in your interest to support the conservatives, who would keep out cheap goods from the United States that would put you out of business. And if you were a railway worker that was subsidized by these things, there were times where the ideological differences between conservatives and liberals on labor policy were not that different at all. In fact, there were times in the 50s where the conservatives would vote on certain labor policies with the CCF and the liberals wouldn't. Right. And there are these periods in history. But yeah, O'Toole is clearly trying to do that. I don't know what his intent is with not voting. I don't know if he was out of the room, if he abstained. I know that a couple liberals like Erskine Smith abstained because he liked some of the motion, but not other thing. He's generally one of these liberals that likes to have it both ways because he lives in a district that's nominally very NDP. And so he's afraid of being challenged from the left.
Yeah.
But I mean, yeah, I don't buy it. I don't buy it. I mean, if we want to see that from O'Toole, he could put forward a motion to make it easier for workers to join a union. Like, he needs to put up or shut up, and he has not put anything up yet.
Now,
the conservatives could likely. I mean, I have to look at the numbers, but there's a chance that if they could put something pro-labor forward, they could pass it without the liberals, because the conservatives plus the NDP plus the Greens, the Bloc maybe as well, they could maybe in a minority parliament pass a pro-labor bill without the government's support potentially. And O'Toole has not done that.
Yeah, because again, for me, it all comes back to rhetoric. Like, for them, it's all about trying to position themselves as a party that represents labor and trying to pretend that they do while liberals don't, when in reality neither do. But one last thing I want to comment on, just in terms of this vote. The Greens also voted with the NDP. Now, there's been a lot of talk. I've seen, think pieces on this about how the Greens and NDP should work together, even when it comes to possibly, elections in some way. What are your thoughts on the relationship between NDP and Greens? And do you see Greens as potentially being a partner along with the NDP when it comes to issues of labor and wealth?
Well, I mean, I certainly think that would have been more possible if someone like Mariam Haddad had won, or even Dimitri Lascaris. Haddad explicitly ran on, like, one of her key platform pieces was cooperation with the NDP, especially the left wing of that party. Like, MPs like Matthew Green and Nikki Ashton and Leah Gazan. She felt like there was an opportunity to build like a socialist green alliance there. And with Enemy Paul winning, I certainly think that in general, the leadership of the Greens is probably going to be too centrist for my taste. So I'm skeptical of like a formal merger at this stage. And that's the argument I made last year as well. I did a video on this months and months and months ago, back when May was still leader before the election, saying that, I understand the arguments in favor of a merger, but personally, I don't think it's in the right space. But I do see Green NDP cooperation potentially being valuable. Now, whether that means shared riding nominations, that's something that there needs to be a lot more work done at the party, at the riding levels, to see if there's any appetite for that. But certainly, I think, and it wasn't always perfect, the BC Greens and the BC NDP effectively had a sort of quasi-coalition government for 3 years in British Columbia, and it worked out at least reasonably well. And I think there is at least potentially the opportunity for the parties to work together, because at least on the wealth tax, at least, they were sort of standing alone against the three other parties. So that's pretty encouraging, and maybe the Greens will recognize the importance of those issues as well, but we'll have to see.
So one last thing. Donald Trump cited Elections Canada in a tweet as a way to attack the election results, him losing the election against Joe Biden. What's this all about? What's Trump's thinking here, or what do you take from him doing this?
Well, I think it's really funny. I mean, for we both have a large American audience. I think it's a lot of Canadians have been very relieved to have something like Elections Canada. And just for context, it's like unlike in the US where your federal election has 50 kind of smaller elections in all the states. In Canada, at least, the federal election is run through one nonpartisan body. And whether it's the actual election or whether it's the counting of votes or whether it's the designing of ridings of districts, which are not gerrymandered in Canada. They're not always perfect, but mistakes happen, but not outright rigging through gerrymandering. A lot of Canadians were very happy, and I think last week Elections Canada tweeted out like we've gotten thousands of thank yous from Canadians seeing the debacle in the States. And Donald Trump did note that in Canada we don't use voting machines, at least not at the federal level in Canada, and in most provinces I know we don't, because it's really hard to rig paper and pen or paper and pencil, right? Like that's what we use here. And I'm sympathetic to the argument in a way, but the fact is, like, Donald Trump won an election with a ton of machine votes literally 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And so the idea that the reason that he lost is because the U.S. uses machines, which they've been doing for a very, very long time now, is 100% BS. And I mean, there are some differences here. Like, most elections in Canada, you go to the polling station, and you get a ballot that's like literally this big, and there's one, you mark one X.
Yeah.
You vote for your member of parliament, and there's usually 5 or 6 choices, from the 3 or 4 biggest parties, and then maybe a couple independents and smaller parties in your riding, depending on where you are. You mark your X, you fold your ballot, and you put it in the box. We don't vote for a congressperson and a senator and a president and a dog catcher and a judge and a sheriff. We don't have all of these things. So I'm sympathetic to the idea that if they had to count those all by hand, it could take a really long time compared to our system. But I mean, there's so many more things that make our electoral system better than the United States that go beyond machines. I mean, I would say the biggest is the no gerrymandering. There's no partisan influence on how ridings are designed in Canada, and I think that's the biggest thing. We have a lot of issues. We have first past the post, which is awful. Same kind of thing in the U.S. where people have to vote against something rather than for it in a lot of cases. But I don't feel like our election has ever been rigged, and I don't ever worry that I won't get to vote and that I won't have my vote counted if I do vote. And none of that has to do with a machine. I think it's part of like the civic culture. And in the U.S., there's just such a frankly, the Republicans hate democracy. And like that's not conservatives in Canada, at least now, will see that if they keep losing, maybe they'll transform. But conservatives right now do not yet hate democracy like Republicans do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, watching the election in the U.S. and just seeing like the insane lineups. Like personally, I've never had to line up for longer than 5 minutes to vote, and I'm sure that's for a variety of reasons. But we have, as you said, no gerrymandering, automatic voter registration. Like we're all just registered, we can vote. We never have any issues. No voter suppression. So when it comes to
same day registration, if you're not registered,
same day registration. It's really easy here to vote, and that's how democracy should work. Where in the U.S. we see, I mean, if anything, I think Trump would have lost by a much larger number had those issues not been in place. Yet he tries to treat the election there as rigged against him, when in reality it's really rigged against Democratic voters. But anyways, hopefully Trump will leave and we can forget about him. But
a few weeks, fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Anyways, Christo, thanks again for coming on. And where can people find your show?
Well, people can find me on YouTube. It's just Christo Aivalis. If you just Google search that or YouTube search that, you'll see it. David will have a link in the description. You can also find me on Twitter, just Christo Aivalis, no spaces, no underdash, and on Facebook as well. You'll find me in all those spaces. I make daily content, so if you like David's stuff, you'll probably at least be okay with mine.
Yep, Christo's content is great. Check it out. I'll link to it below the video. And once again, thanks, Christo, for coming on.
Thanks for having me again.